Hello and welcome to the Texas Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We are pleased to have you with us today on this webinar to talk about the state of voting rights in Texas and what we have found on that topic. Next slide, please. I'd like to start off by introducing our amazing team. My name is Mimi Marziani. I am really honored to serve as the chair of our Texas Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Also on our committee is Joni Baker from College Station, Josh Blackman from Houston, Charles Burchett from Kirbyville, Roisin Calvert from Houston, Francis Carnot from San Antonio, Jason Casella from Houston, Cecilia Castillo from Buda, Bobby Lydia from Duncanville, Merrill Matthews from Coppell, Christina Sanders from Houston, who is today and also going to be presenting, Ron Smeeberg from San Antonio, and Barbara Walters from Plano, who will be presenting as well. Our members are a diverse group of Texans. We have all sorts of positions at public and private organizations, as well as diversity with regards to political leanings, professional experience, racial and ethnic background, and as you can tell, diversity across the big state of Texas. I am really proud to point out that in having such diversity, we meet the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights aspiration to appoint diverse advisory committees. So before we jump into our presentation today, I am really pleased to announce that one of the members of the U.S. Commission is with us today. So I am going to turn the mic over to Debo Adegbile, who is going to say just a couple of words.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, for having me join your webinar on behalf of the National U.S. Civil Rights Commission. I would just like to thank each and every one of you for your volunteer service to channel and chart a way forward in terms of civil rights for the people of Texas. And we regard the state advisory committees as an integral piece of the nationwide civil rights effort, and the work that you have done in the area of voting and more broadly has been exemplary. So hats off to you, and thank you for that service to your fellow Texans and to the nation. As you all know, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission last year finished up its national examination of minority voting rights, and we did an assessment of minority voting rights before this so-called Shelby County decision and after. And that report benefited from a lot of things and took a broad look at the state of minority voting rights. But one of the things that really made important contributions to it were the SACs from around the country who had taken up voting in their own right and had brought the state of voting rights and challenges on the ground in states across the country up close and personal and brought them into sharper focus. The work that was done by you and your committee and the other SACs was so important that we referenced it in our report and also separately have a web link to all of the State Advisory Committee reports that were done on voting. And so as eyes and ears on the ground, you contributed appreciably to our effort at the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and we're grateful for it. It's noteworthy that Texas has been such a central playing field for voting rights historically, and that pattern has not been broken on the other side of Shelby County, as you know, and as your report documents. And certainly in the national report, there was a whole chapter that sort of focused on Texas and North Carolina in particular. And so we know that there are a lot of issues and challenges being litigated and worked through in your state, and your efforts to speak about them and explain their impact on voters is tremendously important. One of the things that we do on the other side of these reports is to try and get word out about our good work and your good work, and there has been an unusually high degree of interest in the work of the commission in the area of voting, and the chair of the commission and myself and some of the other commissioners have been out carrying the word of the work that was done both by the state advisory committees and by the National Commission, and we've participated in a number of fora to discuss the issues and findings of the report, and specifically to point them to the state-by-state reports. There's nothing like taking the examination of voting closer to the ground and closer to the people who are affected, and that's one reason why, in anticipation of our report, we conducted our briefing in the field and actually went to North Carolina to receive testimony in that place. It's a sampling of some of the audiences that we've been before talking about the work of the Civil Rights Commission are, I participated in the Elion Higginbotham Memorial Voting Rights Brain Trust at the Congressional Black Caucus in Washington, D.C. The chair, vice chair, and myself presented to the Tri-Caucus and testified in a briefing that they had that was focused on the report, on our report and the report of the SACs. The chair recently testified before the House Judiciary Committee talking about the findings of the report in connection with some of the voting bills, many of which are the first bills that the new House of Representatives put on the legislative agenda. And then the chair and I have also met with the House Elections Subcommittee to discuss the report. All of this is to say the work is important. It doesn't gather dust on the shelf. People are looking at it. They're considering its implications. And I bring both greetings and thanks from the U.S. Commission to all of you for your commitment and your volunteerism in service of your fellow citizens and residents of Texas.
Thank you, Commissioner. It's really helpful to hear about our work and context, and I know I speak for the entire committee when I say that we could not be more pleased that our work has been so important to this larger mission to make voting freer and fairer across the country.
Thank you.
Next slide. Next slide, please. So a couple of housekeeping matters and background consideration points from me before we jump into the meat of the presentation. First is a quick note about our jurisdiction. The state advisory committees are responsible for advising the Commission on a number of core civil rights issues: alleged deprivation of voting rights, illicit discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, and problems in the administration of justice. We are specifically asked to forward advice and recommendations to the Commission and to help the Commission with the development of reports that will ultimately go to the President and to Congress. And as the Commissioner noted, in the fall of 2018, the Commission, in fact, issued a 2018 statutory enforcement report on voting rights, which was indeed sent to the President and Congress, and that included our contributions. Next slide. So our objective as a state advisory committee was to conduct a qualitative fact-finding study. And as I noted before, it was really important to us in undertaking our task that we involve as many diverse perspectives and viewpoints and experiences as possible. And so to that end, we had a series of public planning meetings. We identified speakers from varying perspectives who could provide greater context on voting rights in Texas. We invited all these speakers to an all-day public briefing on March 13th in Houston, Texas. We asked those who were unable to attend to submit written testimony, and ultimately individuals who contributed ranged in perspective from voting rights advocates to community organizers to county clerks and other local governmental officials to academics to representatives from the Secretary of State's office. One note, while we do believe we succeeded in hearing from diverse perspectives, we were ultimately unable, even after making multiple outreach attempts, to receive testimony from non-governmental individuals or organizations that self-identify as conservative. That was disappointing to me personally. I think to other members of the committee, but that's where we landed, and those perspectives are largely absent from our overall findings. Next slide. So our memo can be found on the Commission's website. That's www.usccr.gov under State Advisory Committee Reports. That's also where you can find the statutory enforcement report the Commissioner mentioned earlier. One last note before we jump into the meat of the presentation. This is the first of two webinars focused on our findings and recommendations. Today we're going to focus on voter registration. But on April 18th at 1 p.m., we're going to discuss two other issues as well, access to polling locations and language access. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Christina, to walk us through some of our findings in greater depth.
Thank you. Okay. So in the next few slides, we will share the various findings pertaining to voter registration derived from the testimony. So if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat function on the bottom of your screen, and Commission staff will compile these questions and will answer them during Q&A. We've also included citations at the end of the presentation so that you can refer to them in case you have specific questions regarding the findings. A copy of this presentation will be available in our agency database, which you can find on the same slide as the citations towards the end. Next slide. So to start off, we heard from panelists that low registration is a common thing. We learned from Rogelio Times that only 68% of eligible voters actually registered. Texas ranks as the 44th worst state for voter registration in the 2016 election, and this is the citing report by the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Life. Next slide. Testimony from numerous organizations and individuals indicated that low disparate registration rates may be due to the state's restriction on third-party voter registration activities, such as voter registration drives. Cited challenges include, to registering voters include materials in the state's VDR training program. They vary greatly amongst the counties. There are several criminal penalties associated with failure to comply with VDR requirements. While the law requires that VDRs issue a receipt every time they complete a VDR transaction, there are no standard procedures for doing so. And one result of these burdensome requirements that low numbers of VDRs are available to support Texas's growing population. Next slide. Speakers also pointed to the potential barriers for Latinos, as they are less likely to be registered in comparison with other groups. These barriers to voter registration include that not all counties are making registration materials in Spanish readily available to the public or VDRs. VDR training is not always provided in Spanish, even in counties that are required by the federal government. Low registration rates amongst Latinos have been associated with mistrust and fear due to the public discourse concerning voter fraud and immigration. And also, low Latino registration may be associated with apathy as a result of not having adequate representation amongst elected representatives. Next slide.
Christina, if you can speak a little bit louder.
So another group who experienced barriers to voter registration were young voters. For the 2016 general election, only 48% of Texans ages 18 to 35 were registered to vote, while 78% of Texans over the age of 65 were registered. This is 7 percentage points lower than the national average rate for eligible voters between ages 18 to 24. Panelists indicated that Texas law mandates that all high schools, both public and private, must offer voter registration for eligible students at least twice a year to a designated high school deputy registrar. And several stakeholders indicated that this law was not being enforced by the Secretary of State's office. The result is that too few of the roughly 330,000 young people who graduate from Texas public schools each year are being registered to vote. Our panelists explained the widespread noncompliance with the state's high school voter registration mandate may be due to the lack of knowledge and confusion about requirements and procedures. Next slide. The notion of widespread confusion and misinformation about voter registration was also echoed throughout the hearing. Panelists expressed frustration concerning registration deadlines not being clearly available on county websites. Another stated that citizens moving from one county to another county is a common reason that individuals fail to meet the registration requirements. And registration forms are not readily accessible and available to certain populations, including individuals with disabilities, the elderly, and individuals with limited English proficiency. Next slide. Finally, the state's voter registration procedures are not in compliance with the National Voter Registration Act. Examples of noncompliance include the Texas Department of Public Safety allows online renewal and modification of driver's licenses, but it does not allow for users to register to update their voter registration online. Also, in reference to a past U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report, the processes on the Texas DTS website are misleading and confusing in terms of updating voter registration information. So individuals wishing to update their registration when they update their driver's license must actually take additional steps offline to successfully register. So again, as a reminder, if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and commission staff will compile these questions that will be answered during Q&A. And at this time, Barb Walters will share the committee's recommendations.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, this is Barb. As part of our charge on the advisory committee, we issue recommendations to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We ask them to consider forwarding those recommendations to the appropriate federal enforcement agencies and various state enforcement agencies alike. In the next few slides, we've identified specific actions that each of these entities should take to ensure all voters in Texas participate in the franchise. Next slide, please. The primary enforcement agency that comes to mind is the Department of Justice. Their jurisdiction is to ensure all voting-related activity is carried out. We recommended to the Department of Justice that they enforce and monitor the requirements of the Voting Rights Act, particularly Section 203, that they enforce the National Voter Registration Act, and that they also further investigate the findings within this memorandum over which it has jurisdiction and take appropriate action. Next slide, please. On a statewide level, we recommended to the Texas Secretary of State and its Elections Division that they implement more accessible registration forms by including forms in all covered languages spoken in each county and in Braille and in large print, as cited in the Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. We ask that they ease the certification requirements for volunteer deputy registrars by clarifying existing interpretations of the law and allowing volunteer deputy registrar certification in one county to be accepted in all counties, standardizing training opportunities statewide, and including by establishing at a minimum weekly volunteer deputy registrar training sessions in all counties that have a population of over 250,000. And then requiring the standardized use of statewide registration forms and receipt systems. We want them to recommend that they create a mechanism to track and enforce the high school voter registration law, including providing clearer information about its requirements and best practices. Next slide, please. The committee also directed recommendations to the Texas Legislature to take the following action. Implement a secure online voter registration system to make voter registration easier and more accessible, and to better comply with the National Voter Registration Act. To create a bipartisan commission to study voter registration and election administration and make recommendations to the Texas Legislature as to how to make voter registration and voting secure, easy, and equally accessible for all eligible Texas voters, and to lessen legal repercussions and penalties for volunteer deputy registrars in a manner that encourages voter registration efforts. Next slide, please. The committee further directed recommendations to the Texas Legislature to improve the volunteer deputy registrar procedures in order to better comply with the National Voter Registration Act by allowing more time to return completed forms and the ability to return completed forms by mail. Next slide. And finally, we ask that the Texas County Elections Administrators do the following. Address voter registration by working to track compliance and progress of high school voter registration efforts by providing high school-specific volunteer deputy registrar numbers and increasing outreach efforts to the high schools. While a responsibility of the Secretary of State, county administrators can play key roles in coordinating enforcement and facilitating partnerships with local school districts. Also provide improved and more convenient training for volunteer deputy registrars, which will include greater availability of trainings in more languages, online training, and then reciprocity agreements with adjacent counties. Now let me turn the presentation back to Mimi for some final points.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina and Barbara. It really is an incredible body of work. And for everybody listening, once more, if you're interested in reading through the entire advisory memo, you can find it right here on the website, and we certainly encourage you to do so. Next slide. And for those interested in digging really deep, wanted to flag that we have a transcript available so you can read the full testimony given to us in March in full. And we also have, we've also included detailed citations within our memo so that you can go back to the original source. Next slide. So with that, we will pause and hear from you. What questions do folks have?
This is Anna. I'm a civil rights analyst with the Commission. We did receive a question from the audience, and this will be directed to Christina. The question is, what are one of the criminal penalties associated with failure to comply with the VDR requirement?
For the VDR requirement, so in the Texas Election Code in Section 13, there are two types. So unintentional failure to comply would be to a Class C misdemeanor, and intentional failure to comply leads to a Class A misdemeanor for any volunteer deputy registrar.
And the second question that we received from the audience is, as I understand it, you have to be a registered VDR in the county that you want to register voters in. Do you know if these trainings are the same throughout counties and if they're offered frequently? And this can also be directed to Christina.
So the trainings, no, they are not standardized throughout the counties. And many counties, including Harris County, offers different languages, but the frequency is determined by the county. So it's contingent on the county and whatever they consider frequent, as well as whatever resources they consider that they have. It's not standard throughout the state.
This is Barbara. I might mention, too, that the trainings are very consistent county by county in terms of whether a registrar has to go to the elections office or if they're offered out in the community. and if they're offered online or not. It's very, very variable.
And as a reminder, this is Anna. If you'd like to ask a question, you can use the chat box on the bottom left hand of your screen, and we'll pause a moment for any questions. So we have a question. Will this presentation be available to share, and is there a link for a printed report? And I can answer this question regarding the availability. I can send out the PowerPoint slides after this webinar, so long as you've provided your email when you registered to attend this webinar. And the link to the report is available on our website. It's www.usccr.gov, and you can find it under the State Advisory Committee report.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna.
I was just going to say we don't have any questions at this time, so I'll turn it over to you, Mimi.
Great minds. We were going the same direction there. Thank you, Anna. Thank you again to Christina and Barbara. Thank you to the Commissioner. Thanks to all of you who joined us this afternoon. We really do appreciate it. I hope that you will join us again on April 18th. Again, that's at 1 p.m. Central for a look at polling place administration and language access. If you have any other questions, please feel free to direct them to Anna at the Commission's Civil Rights Office. Her contact information is listed here on this final slide. And that's it. Once more, thanks so much, and we hope that you found this helpful and that you'll spread this information back into the community.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's teleconference. You may now disconnect.